The family of Pastor Charles Stanley finally speaks out about his final days. It's not attractive. Charles Stanley spent half a century preaching to millions about the importance of family values. However, his own family was disintegrating behind closed doors. His spouse filed for divorce. The church was deserted by his son. His daughter saw everything go apart. They are finally speaking now, years after he passed away in 2023. You'll be shocked by what they disclosed about his last days. The final 3 words he ever said altered the relationship between him and his kid, and the man in the pulpit wasn't the one at home. On September 25, 1932, Charles Stanley was born in Dry Fork, a small Virginian village. The Great Depression was in the midst of it. Families went hungry, millions of people felt despondent, and jobs disappeared. Charlie Stanley and Rebecca Hall, his parents, were struggling to make ends meet. Blocks of bread lines extended. Overnight, homes were lost. Raising a child at those times was the worst. Nevertheless, one of the most influential voices in Christian ministry would emerge from that tumultuous beginning. Everything changed 9 months after Charles was born. At the age of 29, his father unexpectedly passed away. He was present one day, and then absent the next. Only a name and silence, no farewell, no memories left behind. During the biggest economic crisis in American history, his mother, Rebecca, was left to raise a baby by herself. Charles never lost the feeling of abandonment. He frequently talked about having a hole in his heart as a child, wondering who his father was, and what type of guy he would have been if he had followed his advice. His later discussion of God as the Father who never departs, never forgets, and never turns away, was influenced by that desire. Rebecca remarried when Charles was 9 years old. She believed that by providing her son with the father figure he had lost, she was acting morally. However, that choice almost brought them both to ruin. John Hall, her new husband, had a terrible temper and was an alcoholic. Almost instantly, the horror started. Rebecca became aware that she had married into a falsehood 2 weeks after the wedding. Hall had been duped by her own family. They were aware of his abuse. They assured her that if he married, he would change. He didn't. Charles was much more terrified. He saw his mother being strangled by his stepfather. Every night, he shut the door to his bedroom. He occasionally even put a loaded rifle next to his bed as a precaution. He grew up in a conflict area. He wasn't merely scarred by that tragedy, it helped shape him. It taught him that faith is necessary for survival, and that the only person you can genuinely trust is God, not other people. Charles sought solace in the church amidst the turmoil at home. He has Pentecostal roots. In Dry Fork, his grandpa, George Washington Stanley, was a founding member of the Emmanuel Pentecostal Holiness Church. Charles absorbed the ferocious preaching, clamorous prayers, and intense passion that accompanied Pentecostal worship from his parents, who were enthusiastic members. He would hide out in the church basement on the hardest evenings at home. He prayed out there, pleading with God for peace while sobbing and yelling. He discovered that praying was more than just whispering, it was pouring out of his heart. He never lost his Pentecostal zeal, even after he converted to the Baptist faith. It influenced the way he led, communicated, and preached. At the age of 17, a life-altering event occurred. Charles traveled to Siler City, North Carolina, to see his grandfather. He wasn't sure he wanted to be a pastor. He felt weak, damaged, and too young. However, his grandfather handed him a single line that would serve as his life's compass. "Charles, you should flee if God commands you to poke your head through that brick wall. He is responsible for creating the whole." It came to him like a thunderclap. His fundamental beliefs became clear after that. Respect God, and let Him handle the fallout. It was more than a motto. It was a matter of survival. Obedience served as his compass when life provided no answers. Charles started attending formal schooling in the 1950s. After attending the University of Richmond, he went on to Fort Worth, Texas's Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. At the time, Bible colleges were flourishing. Since 1945, enrollment had increased. Christianity was finding a fresh voice on television and radio, as the world changed quickly. In 1949, Billy Graham began his crusades. Evangelism was spreading across the country. Charles jumped right in, learning Hebrew, Greek theology and preaching. He was studying more than simply the Bible. He was learning how to put it into people's lives and make it real. Charles was only 25 years old in 1957, but he was already teaching, preaching and serving as a pastor at Fruitland Baptist Church in North Carolina. Despite being a small church with only 150 members in a mountain town, it was just what he needed. He was a full-time preacher and taught evangelism and homiletics at the local Bible Institute. His pay, it was only $75 a week, but it didn't matter to him. He was engaged in his passion. He was learning how to communicate, lead and connect with individuals going through difficult times. Many of his members struggled with poverty and uncertainty as manufacturing workers or farmers. He did not just preach to them. He offered them hope. At the age of 26, he received his official Baptist ministerial ordination in 1958. That was a really young age. Charles was prepared, but most pastors were ordained in their 30s. He had the ideal timing. Evangelism on television was booming. Every channel featured Billy Graham. Oral Roberts had just started his own ministry on television. Charles would be next. His ordination certificate granted him the authority to head congregations, get married, and perform baptisms that same year. More significantly, though, it signaled the beginning of a brand new ministry that would eventually serve millions of people worldwide. Charles moved around a lot between 1959 and 1968. First to Miami, Florida, then to Bartow, Florida, and last to Fairborn, Ohio. Every church had fresh difficulties. He was the leader of a church close to a large Air Force post in Fairborn. Due to the Cold War buildup, the town was expanding quickly. While serving as a pastor in Miami during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he witnessed his church's membership quadruple from 400 to over 800. Nevertheless, he continued to move despite his accomplishment. By 1968, he had taken a smaller church in the sleepy 12,000-person city of Bartow. It is generally regarded as a step backward. Charles, however, saw it as an opportunity to create something tangible. He desired to establish strong roots and begin anew. That restless time wasn't a failure. It was a training session. He was honing his craft, picking up knowledge from every community, and anticipating the turning point. Charles Stanley had no idea what type of struggle he was into when he entered First Baptist Atlanta in 1969. The church was divided. Politics and theology were the causes of faction warfare. Stanley, too, in the center of it, was only the assistant pastor. One meeting became so heated that he was actually punched. He didn't leave, though. He remained. He bore the strain, the whisper campaigns, the open animosity for 2 long, cruel years. Then October 1, 1971, arrived. To determine whether Stanley should be appointed senior pastor, the church held a standing vote that day. There was tension in the room. The feelings were unfiltered. However, the solution became evident once the votes were counted. Indeed, Stanley was 39 years old, and the 16th pastor of one of the most powerful churches in the South. However, there was a cost. Many of his opponents left for good, leaving a church that was broken and bruised but at last prepared to carry on. He took an even greater risk a year later. Stanley introduced the Chapel Hour on WXIA-TV 11 and WONKS 46, 2 local Atlanta television stations, in 1972. The show lasted only 30 minutes. Nothing spectacular, yet it garnered enough attention because it was seen by 16,000 local viewers. Christian networks were looking behind the scenes for voices that were genuine and useful. Stanley's straightforward Bible instruction was ideal. The Christian Broadcasting Network made contact in 1978. They required content as they constructed a new satellite system. Yes, Stanley replied. His viewership grew from 16,000 in Atlanta to a national audience in just 1 week. The initiative was given a new name, a new identity, and contact with Dr. Charles Stanley. It was broadcast on television in practically all of the major American cities by the early 1980s. Then it spread over the world. By the end, 150 countries were broadcasting Stanley's message in 114 different languages. But cameras weren't the first part of his media empire. Classrooms were the first. Stanley established Miami's George Miller Christian School in 1966, 5 years prior to his broadcast debut. At the time, he continued to serve as a pastor at First Baptist, Miami. Education was not the only purpose of the school. It has to do with morals. It bears the name of George Muller, a well-known Christian pastor who provided orphan care based only on faith and prayer. It was that name. Stanley thought that religion should be incorporated into daily life, particularly into the upbringing and education of children. He was completing his graduate degree at the same time, striking a balance between starting a school, a church, and a school. That demonstrated the sort of determination that would come to characterize his national ministry. He relocated to Bartow, Florida, after leaving Miami in 1968, and by 1969, he was on his way to Atlanta. However, those initial years demonstrated something. Stanley's thoughts extended beyond Sunday sermons. He had tremendous ideas, and that thought continued. There were about 5,000 members of First Baptist Atlanta when Stanley took control. That number more than tripled by the 1990s. The church required additional room. He made a contentious choice in 1997. He relocated the entire church to the Dunwoody suburb. After selling the historic Midtown Atlanta property, 3,000 people could be accommodated in the new structure. It was sleek, contemporary, and future-ready. Stanley, however, wasn't solely concerned with the stats. He created programs. The Passion Play, a dramatic recreation of Jesus' last week, was one of the most well-known. It involved hundreds of volunteers and operated from 1977 till 2011. The church was transformed into a media, outreach, and ministry machine under Stanley's direction. After over 50 years, First Baptist Atlanta was more than just a church when he resigned in 2020. It was a national institution. Perhaps the most significant shift, however, occurred in 1978, when his ministry gained wings thanks to technology. That year, everything changed when the chapel hour became accessible through CBN's satellite network. The ascent wasn't gradual. Stanley's visage was beaming into American homes in less than a week. For a preacher in those days, such exposure was unprecedented. Stanley, however, didn't mind being in the spotlight. He accepted it. He formally declared it in 1982. He established In Touch Ministries as a separate organization, which allowed him complete flexibility to grow, and he did. In the same year, radio syndication got underway. He soon reached more than 115 million households in the United States alone. He didn't stop there, though. He used technology that virtually no one else was employing to push into the most isolated regions of the earth. He developed an obsession with invention. Stanley thought that technology was more than just practical, it was necessary. He aimed to reach everyone, including those living in powerless communities. Thus he established Messenger Lab, which consists of 8 distinct solar-powered audio devices intended for those without internet access. No church, no electricity. In addition to the New Testament, Psalms, and Proverbs in 2 languages, one gadget could play 65 of his sermons. Throughout 1 million messenger gadgets were distributed throughout time. We are told that the overall worth is more than $26 million. They also visited more than one area. These gadgets made it to Antarctica as well as every other continent. Stanley's sermons, meanwhile, were broadcast on over 4,000 radio, television, and satellite stations. He spoke 127 different languages. Because he thought this was the best time in history to share the gospel, he was on podcasts, internet platforms, mobile apps, and more. He was also a political lightning rod in addition to being a media behemoth. Stanley was elected president of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1984. In the history of the denomination, it was one of the most contentious periods. Biblical inerrancy, or whether the Bible was entirely accurate in all respects, including science, was the subject of a full-fledged civil war within the SBC. It was dubbed the Conservative Renaissance by conservatives. The moderates referred to it as a takeover. Stanley only needed 52% of the vote to win the presidency. Almost. However, it was sufficient. From 1984 until 1986, he held 2 terms. He also served as the head of the Peace Committee, which was established in 1985 to end the conflict. After 15 contentious meetings, the group produced a 450-word report that supported the views of Stanley and other conservatives. Stanley was in the midst of the SBC's transition to a more theologically conservative stance and direction. Charles Stanley never stopped moving forward, whether it was from a Miami school in 1966 to a church fight in 1971 to a satellite empire in the 1980s. Charles Stanley was at the height of his public career in February 1988. The National Religious Broadcasters Hall of Fame had recently inducted him. It was a momentous occasion. In America, his sermons were being heard in over 115 million homes. Additionally, communicating with Dr. Charles Stanley has become a regular feature on Christian television and radio. He was no ordinary preacher. He was a leader influencing the direction of Christian media and the public face of a movement. However, a much darker event was taking place at home as the rest of the world celebrated him. Stanley went to Kansas City for a ministry event in 1989. A year later, in his hotel room, he was praying when he looked out the window and saw dozens of satellite dishes on neighboring rooftops. He said that God sent him a message at that very moment. The gospel would be spread globally in this manner. He thought about Psalm 67:2, spread the word about your ability to save lives all over the world. It turned out to be a pivotal occasion. His sermons would later be aired on more than 4,000 networks worldwide and translated into 127 languages. However, the man behind the message was disintegrating as it was being distributed. Anna, his wife, had been feeling more and more alone. Charles was increasingly absent as he pursued church expansion and broadened the scope of his ministry. She once said, "He chose his priorities, and I have not been one of them." She wasn't speaking in anger. She was speaking from years of pain. By the early 1990s, Anna had stopped attending his church services altogether. Their son Andy, who would later become a megachurch pastor himself, watched it all unfold. The cold silences, the growing distance, the slow collapse of a marriage that had lasted nearly 4 decades. In June 1993, Anna finally filed for divorce. She didn't use her full name, just A.J. Stanley. But there was no mistaking who it was. The papers claimed their marriage was irretrievably broken. Evangelical circles exploded. This was Charles Stanley, the man who preached about family values every Sunday, and now his own marriage was unraveling in public. The backlash came fast. Some pastors turned their backs on him. Others demanded he step down from the pulpit. The shock wasn't just about the divorce, it was about the image. Stanley had built a reputation around the very thing he was now accused of failing, but the story didn't end quickly. Anna withdrew the petition at one point, hoping for reconciliation. When that didn't work, she refiled in 1995. For 7 years, the Stanleys lived in a state of painful limbo, legally married, emotionally distant, and publicly scrutinized. Christian radio stations dropped his sermons. Some church leaders privately urged him to resign. But Stanley kept preaching, week after week. It wasn't just persistence, it was defiance. The Southern Baptist Convention was not amused. Stanley had once served as its president. Now they were calling for him to step down. He had even told his own congregation years earlier that if he ever got divorced, he'd leave the ministry. Now he was divorced, or close to it, and still behind the pulpit. Even members of his staff resigned, his son Andy too. The divorce was finalized on May 11, 2000. The judge signed off on what was officially an uncontested case. Charles was 67 years old. His sermons were being broadcast in 50 languages. But at that moment, he was no longer a husband. The man who once defined Christian family values had lost his own family. Anna would remain single until her death in 2014. Charles never remarried. Church bylaws allowed him to stay as pastor as long as he didn't take another wife. He addressed his congregation shortly after the final papers were signed. Calmly, he said, "God has assured me I'm where He wants me to be, doing what He has called me to do." And then the shocker, His church overwhelmingly supported him. The board of deacons voted 35-3 to keep him. In a later interview, Stanley said something that stunned many. "I never felt like I really even divorced her. She asked for it. I responded to it." That single line captured the depth of denial or conviction, depending on how you saw it. But not everyone agreed. Andy Stanley had quietly walked away from First Baptist Atlanta years earlier. He didn't just leave the church, he left the entire dynasty. He was supposed to inherit the pulpit. Instead, he broke away and launched a church of his own. In 1995, he gathered a group of people and formed North Point Community Church. It wasn't just a new building, it was a whole new philosophy. He said, "Atlanta doesn't need another church. What it needs is a safe space for the unchurched." It was a not-so-subtle jab at everything his father's ministry represented. By the end of the first year, over 4,000 people were attending North Point. Today the church reaches over 43,000 people across multiple locations. It was an empire in its own right, and it had nothing to do with Charles Stanley. The father had one of the biggest ministries in the world. The son built one of the largest churches in the country, and they weren't even speaking. Their feud became legendary. Christian media couldn't stop talking about it. Everyone had a theory, an affair, mental illness, control issues, jealousy. Whatever the reason, the silence between father and son became symbolic of everything wrong with evangelical leadership. Two men who taught forgiveness, but couldn't offer it to each other. Eventually, they tried counseling, weekly sessions, brutal honesty. One day Andy asked the counselor, "When do I give up on my dad?" The counselor replied, "When your heavenly Father gives up on you." That line hit hard. Slowly, painfully, they began to talk again. One lunch meeting changed everything. Charles looked at his son and said, "I don't want us to end up like all those other fathers and sons." Andy answered softly, "Me neither, Dad." By 2013, Andy's North Point Community Church had grown to about 30,000 members across 5 campuses. It had become the second largest church in the United States. Even more remarkable, his father Charles Stanley, the same man who had once felt abandoned by Andy's departure, stood at his own pulpit and praised him publicly, passionately. That same Charles, who had once taken subtle jabs at Andy during sermons, now proudly told his congregation about Andy's church planting plans. He even gave his blessing. Privately, Charles admitted those words didn't come easy. The wounds were still fresh, but he said them anyway. That blessing marked a major shift. Years earlier, they could hardly speak, but over time things changed. They didn't just speak, they preached for each other's churches. The same father who once saw his son as a rebel now saw him as a partner, and Andy never forgot that. He knew he had a front row seat growing up, learning from one of the most powerful preachers in America. Charles had led First Baptist Atlanta for over 5 decades. He'd even been president of the Southern Baptist Convention, but now, he was watching his son lead a new generation. In Charles' final months, everything slowed down. He couldn't move much. He spent his days in a big leather chair, his body too weak to carry him anymore. But his mind, still sharp, his heart, still on fire. Andy visited often, and every time he knelt beside that chair they would talk. Then Charles would say, "Pray for me." This became their new rhythm, a rhythm of healing. Andy said those visits were precious beyond words. That chair became a sacred space, a symbol of peace between two men who had once been distant. Charles no longer stood on stages, he no longer thundered from the pulpit, but in that chair, through quiet prayers, he found something just as powerful. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time when their dinners were silent and strained. They'd sit in restaurants, knowing they should talk, but not knowing how. The divorce between Charles and Andy's mother, Anna, had shattered more than just a marriage. It had shaken their bond as father and son. Charles admitted he was afraid of what might happen between them. "We've both seen what happens to fathers and sons who go through something like this," he told Andy once, "and I don't want that to happen to us." That fear pushed them to rebuild, slowly, steadily. It took nearly 25 years. Then came the phrase that changed everything. "I couldn't be prouder of you, Andy." He said it more than once. It became his habit. He didn't just mean it, he wanted Andy to know it. Coming from Charles Stanley, those words carried weight. Andy said it best. The source of a word determines its weight. Charles could have held on to old arguments. Andy had taken bold theological stances, ones that ruffled feathers. He challenged traditions, but Charles never scolded him publicly. He never lashed out over Andy's views on the Old Testament or LGBTQ+ issues. Instead, he said those 7 words over and over, and they healed something no sermon ever could. The final moment between them was something out of a storybook. It was Saturday night, April 15, 2023, just 3 days before Charles passed away. Andy visited like he always did. He expected the same routine: kneel beside the chair, say a prayer, hear a quiet "thank you." But this time, something shifted. As Andy got up to leave, Charles asked, "Can I pray for you?" It was the only time he'd done that. Andy didn't know it then, but it would be the last thing his father would ever say to him. He prayed, and then he said it again. "I couldn't be prouder of you, Andy." Those were his final words to his son. At 7:30 a.m. on Tuesday, April 18, 2023, Charles Stanley passed away. He was 90 years old. His ministry had started when he was just 14. It ended after reaching every continent through 2,800 radio and TV outlets in 150 countries. His sermons were translated into 114 languages. For 66 years he preached. For 50 of those, he led First Baptist Atlanta. He stepped down in 2020, becoming pastor emeritus. But the mission didn't end with him. His In Touch Ministries kept going, and still goes on. Becky Stanley Broderson, his daughter, didn't make many public statements, but she lived through it all. The ministry highs, the family lows. She saw her father's dedication to his calling, but also the toll it took. Their mother, Anna, had filed for divorce in 1993. It wasn't final until 2000. She later said Charles refused to admit their marriage was falling apart. Becky watched her parents' relationship dissolve in public, but she stayed close. She was there when the final chapter was written, and in the obituary, her name stood beside Andy's. In Touch Ministries didn't just survive, it grew into one of the most powerful evangelical networks in history. It started as the Chapel Hour in 1972. By 2017, it was broadcasting on more than 2,800 stations, translated into 114 languages, and reaching people in 150 countries. Just in the US, it was on 500 radio stations and 300 TV networks. Even tribal communities in remote areas heard Charles Stanley preach, thanks to satellite and digital outreach. His sermons didn't fade when he stepped down, they became permanent, archived, ready for the next generation. But none of that fully captured the contradiction at the heart of his life. Charles Stanley, who taught about family values, couldn't keep his own family from falling apart. His wife walked away. His son once felt betrayed. His daughter saw the cost of a global ministry up close. He preached about healing, but had to learn how to do it himself. He was raised by an alcoholic stepfather. That survival instinct, fierce and made him a powerhouse in the pulpit, but it also made him hard to live with. That paradox didn't weaken his message. It made it real.